Hello, and today we're reviewing the HyperTough 80214 2-speed brushless 3/8 inch impact wrench. So let's go ahead and get started. Okay, first up we have the battery slot and battery. Now the battery slot in this particular tool is a fairly well designed slot. The battery fits into place nice and firmly and securely with next to no looseness or play to speak of. As a matter of fact, this probably has the tightest tolerances that I have seen from any power tool that I've yet reviewed. So quite frankly, I have no complaints about the overall design and functionality of the battery slot on this particular tool. Other than the fact that it makes the tool a little bit wider than I personally like, but that's more of a personal preference thing than anything else. Now the battery that comes with this particular tool is a 4 amp hour battery, which is a definite improvement over the previous generation 2 amp hour battery. This means that the battery will be able to supply a little bit more power and a longer runtime, and it will also give you the ability to have the tool standing up in a standing position rather than having to lay the tool down on its side where it has a higher chance of getting dust or other debris into the motor housing. And when you couple it with the fact that it comes with a cradle charger rather than the barrel plaque charger, I have to say that I'm very happy with all the decisions that they decided to make here, and everything passes with flying colors. Okay, next up we have the grip. Now the grip on this particular tool is fairly comfortable. It features a very nice rubberized texture that has lots of indentations as well as ridges and just gaps and other, molded features that allow you to maintain a firm grip on this particular tool. And quite frankly, I think they did an excellent job with the rubberized texture, and I have zero complaints about that. Now when it comes to the overall diameter of the grip, it's a little bit on the large size. It's not horrible, it's still completely functional, and it could definitely be far worse, but for my own personal liking, I would have preferred to be a little bit narrower. But because of where the battery is situated, there really isn't too much they could have done to, well, make it a little bit slimmer, unfortunately. But at the end of the day, I think it's more than adequate enough, and I think most people will be perfectly satisfied with this particular grip. If you have smaller hands, it might be a little bit harder for you to use this particular tool, but not impossible. Moving on. Okay, next up we have the trigger. Now the trigger on this particular impact driver is made out of a black plastic and is a single finger trigger. And it is a variable speed trigger, but unfortunately that's where the good news kind of ends. Unfortunately, when you first initially start to pull on the trigger, the slide is interrupted by a rather large bump when it engages with the motor. And unfortunately, this means that you'll usually end up in the second slowest speed instead of the slowest speed. So if you're looking to use this for any sort of delicate work, it's not going to be the best option, unfortunately. And when it comes to slow speeds, even though it has two different modes, none of the modes I would really classify as being slow. They're all fairly quick, and it's definitely going to be a faster impact driver when it comes to the RPM levels, unfortunately. But that is sort of to be expected with an impact wrench. I mean, impact wrenches are sort of like the, sledgehammers of the drilling world. So quite frankly, it's kind of to be expected, but it's still not a great performance, unfortunately. And when it comes to the definition in between those variable speeds, which you have about 6 to 7 to choose from, they're not very well defined, and it's very easy to overshoot or miss one completely. So quite frankly, I do think that the trigger on this particular impact wrench is something that could be redefined or refined in the future for a better overall performance. But with that being said, considering the price point and what you're paying for this particular impact wrench and all the features that you are getting, it is still a very good value for the money. And it's still a budget tool, so you can only be so picky. So with that being said, let's go ahead and move on to the next part of the tool. Okay, next up we have the selector switch for the forward, reverse, and safety. Overall, it's a good showing. It's made out of plastic, it's not in the way, and you can easily put it into whatever position you need it to be in. And when it is in the safety position, no matter how hard you pull on the trigger, the light will not become activated. So this should be a fairly safe tool to throw in a bag of tools with the battery inserted. So quite frankly, everything here passes with flying colors. Moving on. Okay, next up we have the battery life indicator lights. Now the battery life indicator lights are located on the left side of the tool, not on the right side. There are no lights on the right side of the tool, and so if you want to check to see what your battery level is currently at, you will simply pull the trigger when the safety is not engaged, and the lights will light up to display how much battery life is left. Each light represents about 33.3% of the battery, and so when all the lights are gone, your battery is probably going to be just about dead or dead. So quite frankly, it's a fairly simple system, but it's completely adequate. Moving on. Okay, next up we have the belt clip. Now the belt clip comes pre-attached to the tool and it's located on the left side of the tool and is made out of metal and is fairly rigid. And unlike on the cheap drill from the HyperTough 12-volt system, you can mount the belt clip on either side of this particular tool, so it is lefty and righty friendly. which is going to be something a lot of people will appreciate. Overall, it seems to work very well, and when you have it mounted on your belt pocket or whatever else you might be hanging it off of, it seems to stay in place just fine, and I haven't had any major issues. Of course, it's not going to hold it securely enough to go jogging, but you get the point. It's completely adequate for its intended purpose, so no complaints from me. Moving on. Okay, next up we have the LED light. Now the LED light is located directly above the trigger and will become activated when you pull the trigger. It will remain active for around 10 seconds and then it will power down. But as long as you are holding the trigger, it will stay illuminated as long as that motor is receiving power. Quite frankly, it does a good job and I don't really have any complaints. It's better than several lights on some more expensive tools I own, and there is really nothing wrong with it. So at the end of the day, I'm perfectly satisfied with it and it gets a pass from me. Moving on. Okay, next up we have the mode select. Now the mode select buttons are located on top of the tool and is going to be comprised of, well, two different buttons. The first mode, mode 1, is going to be your slower speeds, and the second mode, mode 2, will be your faster speeds. You will only be able to select your mode once the motor has been activated by pulling the trigger, but as soon as the motor becomes activated, they will start to glow because there's an LED light located in either one of the switches, and then once you press that mode or whichever mode you need, they will switch over to that mode, and then it will remember that mode even if you remove the battery pack. Overall, everything here works as intended, and I don't have any complaints. The location is in a fairly convenient spot, and it seems to work just fine. The buttons are made up of a rubber material that has the numbers that are transparent so that the light shines through so you'll know which mode that you're currently on, and everything just works as intended. Quite frankly, I don't think there's a better way they could have implemented this, and it works great. And it's nice to see two different modes instead of the one mode that the previous generation had. So quite frankly, everything here gets a pass. Okay, let's talk a little bit about the differences in between the previous generation and the newer one. Now, the previous one on the right and the newer one on the left are basically identical from the outside. The newer one's only difference when you're looking at the externals of this particular tool is the fact that, well, it has buttons on the top of it and the previous one does not. And if you put the 4 amp hour battery in, then you can really tell the difference because the previous one only came with a 2 amp hour battery. The other main difference is that the newer one is less powerful than the previous generation one. The previous generation had more power, which means that it might work better in certain situations, but you also have a higher chance of breaking whatever you're working on because it's producing more torque. Personally, for me, I personally prefer having the newer generation one because it gives you a little bit more control over the different amounts of torque, and it comes with a larger battery, not to mention a charging cradle. So, quite frankly, I prefer the newer one. With that being said, let's move on. Okay, let's talk a little bit about the square drive, aka the socket holder, aka the anvil, aka the chuck, aka whatever you want to call it. I'm just going to call it, the square drive. Now, the square drive on this particular tool is a 3/8 inch square drive, and it does a fine job. For the most part. I am a little bit disappointed that the tolerances aren't a little bit tighter, but it's not going to be that big of a deal, and at least it's easy to remove the sockets, and they're not overly tight on this particular impact wrench. But I personally think that the tolerances could be a little bit tighter to, well, help with the retention of sockets and other attachments that you might be mounting onto the square drive on this particular impact wrench. Quite frankly, it does have a nasty habit of letting go of, well, other attachments such as hex bit holders, and just anything else you might be trying to mount on the front of this particular impact wrench. This can have a little bit to do with, well, whatever kind of socket you're using, and it's not always going to be completely the impact wrench's fault, but I am using Hyper-Tough impact sockets, and I'm using a Hyper-Tough wrench, so I was hoping that the tolerances would be pretty well spec'd. But unfortunately, it would drop a socket occasionally, and it definitely was not able to hold on to the hex bit holder nearly as well as other brands that I've seen in the past. So quite frankly, this is an area of the tool that could use some improvement in the future as far as I'm concerned. So it's adequate, but could use improvement. With that being said, let's move on. Okay, without a battery, but with a socket attached, it weighs 1,053 grams, which is 2.3 pounds. And with the socket and battery both attached, it weighs 1,491 grams, which is about 3.2 pounds. So it's a fairly lightweight impact wrench. Okay, let's go ahead and talk about this particular tool in use. I have to say, it's actually a fun little tool to use. It's definitely not as powerful as the previous generation, but it doesn't need to be. And quite frankly, with this particular kind of a tool in this particular form factor, having a little bit less power can actually help you complete your task without destroying whatever you're working on. I definitely think that this tool is going to be well designed for people who like to do small engine repairs on their own, say, working on your lawnmower, your blower, your snow blower, your tiller, your auger, that sort of a thing. This is going to definitely be a major help, and having that finer control over the speeds and not as much power means that you're going to have a less of a chance of destroying whatever you're working on. So I'm perfectly satisfied with the trade-off they made here with the newer generation. Not to mention that having a 4 amp hour battery for the same price point and a cradle charger is a definite upgrade and a good way to get into this particular system. I definitely think the area on this tool that needs the most improvement, however, would definitely be, well, just the overall square drive. I just have an issue with it dropping, you know, the hex bit holders and the just sockets occasionally because of just the poorer tolerances versus, you know, several other tools I own. It's definitely not going to be the most well-engineered square drive on the market, but it's good enough to get the job done, and for the price point, you really can't complain all that much. But I'm still going to because, well, that's just kind of what I do here. So, quite frankly, there are some improvements that could be made with the square drive and trigger, but pretty much all the other aspects of this particular tool are very good. And don't get me wrong, the trigger is still completely functional, and the square drive is good enough. As long as you remember what this particular impact wrench is capable of, trying to drive in larger lag screws or bolts into wood is definitely not going to be what this particular tool excels at. Quite frankly, it's just not going to do a good job at that at all. And I would highly recommend upgrading to a larger 1/2" or 20-bolt drill in order to, well, perform those particular tasks. Yes, you will be able to get 1 or 2 in, but you're going to put a lot of wear and tear on that motor, and you're definitely going to drastically reduce the amount of service life of this particular tool. So with that being said, just make sure that you spec your tool out for your job and you'll be fine here. I think this particular impact wrench is definitely going to be a great tool for the average DIYer who is doing their own small engine repairs, working on their bikes, changing parts and pieces out, doing putting in small lag bolts, that sort of thing. It's going to be an excellent tool at an excellent price. But remember that this is not going to be a tool that you'll want to use for removing the lug nuts off of your vehicle or driving in large lag screws. This is going to be good for light-duty torque applications where a larger impact wrench just is going to be too powerful. With that being said, let's move on to the pros and cons. And the first pro is price. Overall, this is a very affordable tool, and when you consider all that you're getting when you buy this particular tool, it is an excellent value, and so this is a pro in my opinion. Small. Overall, this is a fairly compact impact wrench, and it will fit into a lot of spaces that a larger impact wrench, say a 1/2" impact wrench, just won't be able to fit into. So, quite frankly, this is a pro in my opinion. Build quality. The build quality on this particular impact wrench is actually very good, and with the exclusion of a few minor problems, it still is a very nice tool at a very affordable price. So, in my opinion, this is a pro. 2 modes. Having 2 modes is definitely a nice feature, and it's not something you find a lot of times on cheaper impact wrenches from a brick and mortar store. So in my opinion, this is a pro. 4 amp hour battery. Since this particular tool comes with a 4 amp hour battery, I would definitely consider that to be a pro. Moving on. Belt clip. Overall, the belt clip can be fastened on either the right side or left side of the tool, which means that this is friendly for your lefties and righties. So in my opinion, this is a pro. LED light. Overall, the LED light does a very good job at illuminating the area directly in front of the tool and is actually of a higher quality than of several brands that are far more expensive. So in my opinion, this is a pro. And the first con would be the tool lineup. Unfortunately, Hypertough's tool system is fairly new to the market, and it definitely doesn't have the full plethora of tools that some of its competitors have. So in my opinion, this is a con. And the next con would be socket retention. Unfortunately, the square drive on this particular impact driver isn't going to be made to the same tolerances as other impact drivers on the market, and so in my opinion, this is an area of the tool that could use some improvement. And last but not least, the trigger. Unfortunately, this does not have any very slow speeds, and quite frankly, the trigger is rather unimpressive. So in my opinion, this is another area on this particular tool that could use some improvement, but is still completely functional. Okay, and that is it for the pros and cons. Final thoughts on this particular impact wrench. This is actually a very good value, and I have to say I've been pretty happy with its performance. It's definitely not going to be as powerful as a larger impact wrench, but for your small jobs, such as working on small engines or things of that nature, this is going to be able to provide quite a bit of value for the price that you're paying. And it's an excellent way to get into the Hypertough system because you'll be getting a charger and a 4 amp hour battery, not to mention, well, the impact wrench itself. So quite frankly, for the price of $55, you're going to be hard pressed to find another impact wrench from a brick and mortar store that will be able to compete against this particular product. Now that's not to say that this is going to be the best impact wrench on the market, don't get me wrong. Milwaukee's M12 system is, well, pretty much the kings at this particular game, and quite frankly, I don't think that this is going to be able to compete against their particular lineup of tools, but they are far more expensive, and so at the end of the day, if you're on a budget, this isn't a half bad tool to look at if you are not a working professional. This is an excellent tool for your average DIYer, and so this particular tool comes recommended. And that is it for this video. If you liked it, please like and subscribe, and we will see you next time. God bless.